What's so tiring about staying home with the kid and doing housework? What more could you possibly want? When Matteo rubbed his furrowed brows and spoke in that utterly exhausted yet matter-of-fact tone, Lena felt as if the blood in her veins had frozen solid. Gazing at the messy remnants of the birthday party scattered across the floor and her son's tightly shut bedroom door, she realized for the first time that in this marriage, her feelings meant less than nothing to him, less than a dog's. The air in Vienna's 13th district always carried the faint, lingering scent of a half-awakened old dream. This was especially true in the corridors of this middle school, where the afternoon sun slanted through like a blunt knife, slicing through the drifting dust motes. Those specks of dust were the ashes of chalk, mingling with the overly sweet aroma of baked bread wafting from the cafeteria down the hall, a strange blend, warm yet choking. Standing at the end of the corridor, Lena Valentino felt she had become just one of those motes of dust, insignificant, adrift, with nowhere to anchor herself. She had just dropped off her 6-year-old son, Luca, at his classroom. The soft, downy feel of his hair brushing against her palm still lingered. That faint warmth was the only tangible thing she'd clung to all morning. For the rest of the day, that spacious, bright apartment, so empty it echoed, would be waiting for her. Cleaning, preparing dinner, tidying up the design sketches Matteo tossed aside without a second thought, day in, day out. She was like a nail hammered into an ornate picture frame. Her only purpose was to hold up the painting titled, Perfect Family, and no one would spare the nail a second glance. Mrs. Valentino. A voice came from her side, mellow and warm, like wine steeped in sunlight. Lena trembled slightly, jolted out of her self-effacing reverie. Emil Cohen stood at the door of a classroom, a spread-out lesson plan in his hands. The sunlight fell just so on his shoulders, gilding his slightly worn yet neatly pressed beige knit sweater with a soft glow. He didn't look nearly 50, he kept himself in good shape, and though fine lines crinkled the corners of his eyes, they only added to his elegance, and a certain ineffable, weary charm. "Mr. Cohen," Lena said, automatically tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Luca's math teacher. At every parent-teacher conference, he would gently refer to Luca's unique talent for math, a polite way of saying her son's arithmetic skills were abysmal. But today wasn't a conference day. About Luca, Emil stepped closer, the pages of his lesson plan rustling softly in the wind drifting through the window. The dense clusters of math formulas on the paper looked like some alien script. "I have some thoughts I'd like to share with you." His gaze settled on her face, sharp and attentive, making Lena feel like she was no longer a speck of dust, but someone worthy of careful study. That feeling was long overdue. When Matteo looked at her, his eyes always seemed to pass through her, fixing on some unfinished design detail in the distance. Did Luca get into trouble again? Lena's heart skipped a beat, her fingers curling unconsciously into her palm. On the contrary, Emil smiled, the lines at his eyes softening. He's very bright, and extremely sensitive. It's just that his attention tends to drift to the birds flying past the window, or to figuring out the shape of a piece of chalk, rather than the formulas on the blackboard. There was no reproach in his tone, if anything, a faint, almost imperceptible admiration. "I think what he needs might not be more worksheets, but a little more, well, personalized attention." Personalized attention. Lena repeated the phrase, as if tasting an unfamiliar candy, savoring its potential sweetness. She prepared nutritionally balanced meals for Luca every day, checked every spelling mistake he made, and reminded him to wash his hands and brush his teeth. Wasn't that attention? Not just in his studies, Emil's voice dropped, as if sharing a secret. The corridor was empty, save for the silent drift of sunlight and dust. His fingertips brushed the pages of the open lesson plan, and Lena's gaze followed, only to catch a glimpse of a tiny line of writing, unrelated to the lesson, tucked between two math formulas. The ink was fresh, as if it had been written only recently. "Meet me at the usual place after school." Her heart missed a beat, blood rushing to her head in a hot surge, her ears burning. That handwriting. She tore her gaze away, afraid to dwell on where the usual place might be, or who it was for. This was absurd. She must have misseen. "What I mean is," Emil seemed completely unaware of her distraction, his tone still gentle and composed. Luca is an emotionally rich child. What he might need is more encouragement and understanding. You've raised him to be very polite, Mrs. Valentino, that's quite rare. You've raised him to be very polite. The words were like a tiny needle, pricking the balloon of self-doubt that had swollen inside her. How long had it been since anyone had acknowledged her efforts in this family, let alone offered such direct praise? Matteo took it for granted. Her mother-in-law Carla thought she did far too little. A mix of bitterness and a strange, warm current surged in her chest. She looked up, and her eyes met Emil's. His eyes were dark brown, like calm autumn pools, but now they held a faint light, one that clearly reflected her flustered, yearning face. "Thank you, Mr. Cohen," her voice was dry. "Call me Emil," he smiled, closing his lesson plan, hiding the gap where the tiny note had been. He pulled a vintage pocket watch from his pocket and checked the time. As he flipped the metal case open and shut, a tiny line of engraving flashed by, but Lena couldn't make it out. "I'm sorry, I have another class next period. We can talk more about Luca later, if that's convenient for you." Convenient. As a full-time housewife, her time was like water in a sponge, squeeze it, and all you got was empty nothingness. She nodded, almost flustered by the attention. "Of course, Emil, sir." He nodded and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor until they faded. The air, thick with chalk dust and the smell of baked bread, wrapped around her again, but something felt different. Lena stood rooted to the spot, her fingers unconsciously brushing the cool screen of her phone. The screen was dark, reflecting her blurry image. 28 years old, yet her eyes held a weariness she couldn't shake. She suddenly thought of before she was married, when she'd hunch over her drawing board, her hands and face smudged with paint, her eyes alight with passion. Back then, the colors she painted were bold and vivid. But now? The phone screen lit up suddenly, vibrating softly. It was a WeChat friend request. The profile picture was a simple math symbol, infinity, infinity. The verification message read, "This is Emil Cohen, Luca's math teacher." Lena's fingers hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. The sunlight outside shifted, drowning the tiny note tucked between the lesson plan's formulas in a pool of light, as if it had never existed. That request was a quiet invitation, dropped into the stagnant water of her life. Should she tap accept? Matteo's studio reeked of stale coffee and the distinctive smell of printer paper. It didn't feel like part of a home. It was more like a battlefield left in disarray after a storm of inspiration. Across the large wooden work table, crumpled design sketches, drawing pens of every size, and several mugs emblazoned with the logos of renowned architecture firms were scattered, each rim crusted with a thick, dark brown layer of tea stains. Lena set a fresh cup of coffee gently on a rare empty spot in the corner of the table. She moved carefully, afraid to disturb Matteo, who was bent over his work. At 30, he was still handsome, even more so when focused, his features sharpened by concentration. But that focus rarely lingered on her. Now, his brows were furrowed as he stared at the 3D model on his screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard, paying no attention to his wife beside him. The cold glow of the screen reflected in his pupils, like two flickering, emotionless flames. Lena's gaze fell on a sheet of paper tucked beneath a stack of new sketches. Its edges were slightly curled, revealing a sliver of familiar color. She pulled it out gently. It was an illustration she'd painted the previous month. It showed her family of 3 having a picnic on the grass in Schönbrunn Palace Gardens. Luca was laughing, his eyes crinkled into slits. She was leaning against Matteo's shoulder, the sun was shining brightly. It was just a fantasy. Matteo had been working overtime that day. A thin layer of dust had settled on the drawing, and its edges were creased by the weight of a heavy brass paperweight. It was like an inappropriate, childish gift, carelessly stuffed between important tasks, slowly forgotten. Lena's heart ached, as if the paperweight had hit it softly but firmly. She quietly pushed the drawing further in, trying to hide it completely, as if that could bury her own inappropriate hopes. Her eyes scanned the room. Draped casually over the sofa was the scarf she'd knitted for Matteo the previous winter, grey-blue cashmere, crafted with hours of care. Now it was crumpled in a heap on the armrest, smudged with some unknown white paint. On the bookshelf in the corner, a corner of cardboard peeked out. It was the Father's Day card Luca had drawn, with 3 lopsided stick figures and the words, "I love Dad," scrawled underneath. Matteo had taken it at the time, ruffled Luca's hair, then turned and tucked it into a thick architectural yearbook, never to be opened again. Even in the fridge, when she'd cleaned it the day before, she'd found that next to the dark beer he loved, the carton of fresh milk had expired 2 days earlier. He hadn't noticed, or if he had, he'd thought it didn't matter. Every object here whispered of neglect. She, and her feelings, were invisible in this space, unwanted. Her phone vibrated faintly in her pocket, like a tiny heartbeat beside her. Lena glanced at Matteo out of the corner of her eye. He was completely absorbed in his world of lines and data. She stepped back silently, turned, and walked out of the studio, closing the door softly behind her. Leaning against the cold door, she pulled out her phone. "Infinity, do you have time tomorrow afternoon at 3, after Luca gets out of school? I'd like to talk to you about his study plan. Is the cafe across from the school convenient?" The message was polite, unimpeachable. But that time, that location. Lena's heart began to race again. She thought of those dark brown eyes in the corridor, and it felt as if the unspoken subtext, "You understand me better than Matteo," had been planted long ago. She took a deep breath. The bitter smell of coffee seemed to seep into her taste buds. Her finger hovered over the screen for a long time, then finally pressed down. "Yes. That's convenient." She hit send. Those 3 words were like a stone dropped into a deep pool. She knew ripples would spread, but she had no way of knowing what kind of waves they might stir. She looked up at the closed studio door. On the other side was her husband, in the legal sense, yet separated from her by an invisible, impenetrable wall of glass. Suddenly, this spacious, bright apartment felt even more suffocating than that chalk-dusted corridor. The morning mist lived up to its name. Especially in autumn and winter, when the first light of dawn or the fading glow of dusk fell, a thin mist would cling to the old building, wrapping it in a hazy, ambiguous veil. Room 302. Their usual place. The old carpet was saturated with years of cigarette smoke, mixed with the faint, slightly bitter citrus cologne Emile wore, a unique blend that made Lena feel both drowsy and at ease. The lampshade on the bedside table had a tiny, unnoticeable hole, and the light leaking through cast a small, blurry crescent on the floor. That pool of light just happened to cover the pocket watch Emile had set casually on the table. Brass case, vintage Roman numerals, the hands moving quietly, ticking so softly it was almost inaudible. Like the heartbeat of time, a heartbeat that belonged only to this closed space. Tired. Emile handed her a cup of warm milk. The wall of the white porcelain cup was warm against his long fingers, fingers calloused from years of holding chalk, rougher than Matteo's pampered hands, yet strangely giving Lena a sense of unexpected steadiness. He always remembered to make her milk, adding a little sugar, saying it was good for her, helping her sleep. Lena took it and sipped slowly. The sweet warmth slid into her stomach, easing the tension she'd felt rushing over. She curled up against the not particularly soft headboard, watching as he pulled the thick curtains closed, blocking out the meager daylight and any possibility of prying eyes from outside. He did it naturally, thoughtfully, as if they were true partners. "Matteo, he's never noticed whether I sleep well at night," she heard herself say, her voice carrying a hint of vulnerable complaint and a subtle plea for validation. Here, in this room, complaining about the man she called her husband in the eyes of the law and society felt like a secret ritual, a pledge of loyalty to the man beside her. Emile sat down next to her, his fingers gently combing through her hair. His touch made her shiver, a shiver mixing guilt and overwhelming temptation. "He doesn't understand you," Emile's voice was low, like the hum of a cello, striking a chord in her heart. "He has a rare pearl in his hands, yet he treats it like an ordinary button. Lena, you deserve to be cherished, to be truly seen." Those words were a key, unlocking the tightly closed box inside Lena that craved recognition. She almost drowned in his dark brown eyes. In them, she saw not the haggard housewife she was, but a special, desired, charismatic woman. She set down the milk cup and leaned into him, her cheek brushing the fibers of his sweater, breathing in the reassuring mix of cigarette smoke and citrus. In this moment, in this room wrapped in mist, she was real, she was needed. The anxiety and guilt about morality, about Luca, about Matteo, all were temporarily pushed aside. Her gaze wandered around the room unconsciously. Emile never spent the night here, never brought a change of clothes. His arrivals and departures were always clean, leaving no personal traces of him behind. It was as if he was just a temporary ghost in this room. Her eyes flicked to the drawer of the bedside table, then quickly looked away, afraid to dwell on the past hidden there. Finally, her gaze settled on the lamp. The pocket watch lay quietly, bathed in the crescent of light. Suddenly, the ticking seemed to pause for a split second, so faintly, it was almost an illusion. Had the hands trembled slightly? She blinked, and when she looked again, the hands were moving normally. She must have imagined it. Emile followed her gaze, reaching for the pocket watch. His thumb brushed the smooth case habitually, as if it were a gesture that brought him peace. "It's an old watch," he said casually. "Still keeps good time." Lena had noticed that he always brushed his thumb over the watch when he made certain promises or said particularly sweet things. She'd asked about its origin once, and he'd only said vaguely that it was his father's. Something to do with true love. The invisible thorn of the photo in the drawer pricked her again, but she chose to push it deeper. He just wasn't ready to let go of the past, she told herself. He loves me, he just needs time. I'm the one who can make him truly happy. The mist outside seemed to thicken. Inside the room, the scent of cigarette smoke and citrus, the sweetness of warm milk, and the stale smell of the old carpet blended into an intoxicating spell. The ticking of the pocket watch was steady, weaving a dream she didn't want to wake from. Lena closed her eyes, burying herself deeper in this fleeting, stolen safe haven. As for that thorn, the pocket watch that sometimes stopped, the old photo in the drawer, she'd think about those when the mist lifted. For now, she just wanted to cling to this pathetic illusion of being cherished. Sophia's flower shop was a vivid exception in this drab neighborhood. The glass display windows were polished until they shone, and inside, blooming flowers were arranged in a messy yet harmonious way, each petal glistening with dewdrops, as if they'd just been crying and hadn't wiped their tears dry. The air was filled with a bold yet balanced mix of floral scents, but the most prominent was always the cloyingly sweet aroma of champagne roses, almost overpowering the faint bitterness of lilies and the refreshing scent of eucalyptus. Sweet to the point of desperation, like a grand yet hasty confession. Lena pushed open the door, and the wind chime above the lintel tinkled softly. Well, look who's here, Sophia looked up from a bunch of lush baby's breath. At 29, she had short, neat hair, her apron smudged with dirt and grass clippings, but her eyes were as clear as a post-rain sky, able to see straight into people's hearts. She and Lena had been high school classmates, but after Lena married and had a child, they drifted apart, only reconnecting on this street the previous year. Sophia had quit her job as a receptionist at the Morning Mist Inn and opened this flower shop. Sometimes Lena thought Sophia had chosen to sell flowers because she'd grown tired of the fleeting, ephemeral emotions she'd seen in the hotel, and had turned instead to these lives that, though short-lived, bloomed with unapologetic authenticity. Just browsing, Lena's voice was faint, her eyes darting away as she stared at the buckets of blooming flowers. She needed a splash of bright color to dispel the sticky ambiguity and the emptiness that lingered from the Morning Mist Inn. Sophia didn't ask more questions, just picked up a pair of scissors and skillfully trimmed the stems of a bunch of champagne roses. The scissors clicked crisply, as if cutting through unnecessary ties. "What brings you here today? Where's Luca?" Sophia asked, as if in casual conversation. Matteo offered to pick him up for once, Lena mumbled, her fingers brushing the petals of a pale yellow rose unconsciously. The velvety texture was cool and soft, like Emile's fingertips when they occasionally brushed her cheek. "Pretty, aren't they?" Sophia said, her tone flat, as if stating a fact from a flower language encyclopedia rather than a romantic declaration. Champagne roses. They mean loving you is my greatest happiness. She picked up a trimmed stem and handed it to Lena. But they are delicate. You have to change the water every day, trim the stems, otherwise, bacteria grow in the water, the stems rot, the heads wilt quickly, and the petals fall off at the slightest touch. Lena took the rose, and a thorn on the stem pricked her finger lightly, a tiny sting. See that? Sophia continued trimming the bouquet, her voice steady. Some relationships are like that. They look beautiful, smell nice, but their roots aren't planted deep. They only survive on that little bit of novelty, they can't last. When the time comes, no matter how hard you hold on, you can't keep them. Lena's fingers froze. That invisible thorn seemed to pierce her heart again, pushed deeper by Sophia's words. She stared at the bright and delicate rose in her hand, suddenly finding its beauty false and fragile, as if its petals would wilt the next second. She thought of room 302, of the clothes Emile never left behind, of the hidden photo, of the pocket watch that sometimes stopped. He just needs time, Lena told herself again, trying to suppress the rising unease. You don't look well lately, Sophia changed the subject, but her gaze remained sharp. It's tiring, taking care of Luca alone, isn't it? Is Matteo still the same? Yeah, same as always, Lena lowered her eyes, staring at a cup of mint tea on the shop's small table. The tea was clear, with a few mint leaves unfurled, exuding a cool freshness. She suddenly remembered that many years ago, her hands hadn't held rags, or knives, or her child's dirty clothes, they'd held paintbrushes. The colors on her canvas had been bold and free, like the flowers blooming recklessly around her. But now? Sometimes I feel like I'm one of the flowers in this shop, Lena murmured, her voice so soft it was barely audible. I look lively, but without roots, without water. I'm nothing. Sophia put down her scissors and looked at her seriously. Flowers die without roots and water. But people are different, Lena. People can grow new roots for themselves, find their own source of water. If they want to. The wind chime rang again as a customer walked in. Sophia turned to greet them. Lena stood alone among the flowers, still holding the champagne rose. A tiny drop of blood oozed from the thorn's prickle, like a bright red, anxious tear. She looked at Sophia's busy back, at this flower shop full of life yet unflinchingly realistic, then thought of room 302, wrapped in mist, where time seemed to stand still. Two completely different worlds. Which one belonged to her? In the end, she didn't buy the rose. She set it back gently, as if letting go of an unrealistic fantasy. But the faint sting on her fingertip lingered, spreading slowly, refusing to fade. Sometimes cracks don't appear with a bang, they are like fine lines on a piece of porcelain, barely noticeable at first, until one day, unable to bear the pressure from within, they suddenly split wide open. Preparing for Luca's birthday party had felt like an exhausting battle. Lena had blown up balloons, hung streamers, and baked a cake decorated with the little dinosaur cookies Luca loved, all by herself. Matteo had promised the night before, "Don't worry, it's our son's birthday. I'll be back early." Luca had been excited since morning, his little face flushed as he asked over and over, "When will Daddy be back? Will he bring me that big remote-controlled car?" "Daddy will be back as soon as he's done working," Lena replied, her voice growing less and less confident. She'd sent Matteo messages and called him, but there'd been no reply. By 3 in the afternoon, the party was supposed to start, and the other children were arriving with their parents. The apartment was filled with the screams and laughter of kids, making Lena's head throb. She forced a smile, greeting the children, but her eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall. 3:30, 4:30. The candles on the cake were almost melting in the room's warmth. The light in Luca's eyes faded little by little. He stopped playing with the other kids, just sitting on the corner of the sofa with his knees pulled up, staring eagerly at the door. Matteo probably got stuck with an emergency project. Lena knelt down, trying to comfort her son, and herself. Luca looked up, his big eyes brimming with tears, though he stubbornly held them back. "Daddy's always like this. Does he not like my birthday?" Those words were like a dull knife, slicing slowly at Lena's heart. She pulled her son into a hug, her throat tight, unable to say a word. By nearly 6 o'clock, the door finally clicked open. Matteo walked in, looking exhausted, carrying a huge, elaborately wrapped box with a remote-controlled car inside. "Sorry, there was a last-minute issue with the project." He trailed off as he saw the room full of waiting children, who were now growing restless, and his son on the sofa, eyes red from crying. The party's mood had soured. The kids ate the cake hastily, too distracted to open their gifts, before their parents came to take them home one by one. The apartment was a mess. Streamers hung limply, a few balloons had deflated, and the floor was sticky with cream and cookie crumbs. Matteo tried to hand the remote-controlled car to Luca. "Look what Daddy bought you, son." Luca turned his head sharply, his little fists clenched tight as he yelled through his tears, "I don't want it. You're always late. I hate you." He ran back to his bedroom, slamming the door shut. Matteo's hand froze mid-air, the exhaustion on his face quickly turning to irritation. He set the box down and rubbed his brows. "I'm just trying to make more money, to give this family a better life. What's wrong with that? Why can't you all understand?" Lena was wiping cream off the floor. At his words, she stopped. The anxiety, disappointment, and grievance that had built up all day shattered the dam inside her. "Understand. Matteo, all Luca wanted wasn't the biggest remote-controlled car or the most expensive cake. All he wanted was for you to be there to blow out the candles with him, to smile at him, to say happy birthday, son. Is that so hard?" Her voice rose uncontrollably, trembling. "What is this family to you? A hotel? A place where you just pay the bills and sleep?" Matteo seemed shocked by her outburst. He froze for a moment, then his tone turned colder. "I deal with stress outside, work my ass off, and I don't come home to listen to you complain. Lena, what's so tiring about staying home with the kid and doing housework? What more could you possibly want? You don't even have to work. What do you have to be depressed about?" He'd said something similar before. But this time, after the failed birthday party and Luca's tears, the words hit twice as hard. Lena stood rooted to the spot, her blood turning to ice. She looked at him, this familiar man, now strangely alien. Between them lay an invisible, bottomless chasm. All her efforts, all her loneliness, all her struggles, meant nothing tiring to him. Talking to him was useless. He would never understand. She said nothing more, just continued cleaning up the mess, her movements stiff, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Matteo seemed to realize he'd gone too far. He opened his mouth, but in the end, said nothing. He turned and walked into his study, closing the door behind him. Once again, he'd shut her out of his world with a single door. The apartment fell completely silent, deadly silent. Lena collapsed onto the floor amid the mess, staring at the dried, crusted cream on her fingertips. A wave of nausea washed over her. A heavy, cold loneliness wrapped around her, heavier than ever before. She pulled out her phone. The screen was dark, reflecting her pale, vacant face. No apology from Matteo, no words of concern. Only one WeChat message, sitting at the top of her chat list. "Infinity, I saw you today, you didn't seem to be smiling much. Did something happen? You can talk to me, anytime." It had been sent before the party started, when she'd been at her busiest, most hopeful, and most afraid of disappointment. He'd noticed. He'd seen her lack of a smile. A faint warm current seeped into the cold loneliness. She knew this warmth might come from a place she shouldn't touch, but in this moment, trapped in this suffocating cold and silence, this tiny bit of warmth was the only lifeline she could cling to. Her trembling fingers typed a single word. "Tired." Almost immediately, a reply came. "Infinity, rest if you're tired. Don't forget, you deserve to be treated gently." Tears finally poured out, unbidden. She bit her lip hard, holding back her sobs. In this house, her tears, like her happiness, were invisible, unheard. Only the person on the other side of the phone screen seemed willing to listen to her silent cries. This dangerous, tempting crack was widening little by little, about to swallow all her hesitation and her last remaining boundaries. By the coldest days of winter, things began to fall apart at an accelerating pace. Clara, the quiet school janitor who noticed everything without saying a word, had been cleaning the gym as usual when she found a delicate cufflink tucked between the slats of the locker room bench. Silver, engraved with the school's tiny crest. This brand of cufflink was a special annual reward the school gave to outstanding staff. And the most recent recipient of this honor had been Mr. Emil Cohen. Clara held the cold little object, her brows furrowed. Before retiring, she'd been a primary school teacher, with a near-stubborn commitment to teachers' professional ethics. She thought of the recent afternoons when she'd seen Mr. Emil standing too close to that young, perpetually worried-looking Mrs. Valentino in the empty after-school corridors. She thought of the atmosphere between them, too familiar, yet deliberately distant. She didn't tell anyone, and had no intention of ruining anyone's life. She simply placed the cufflink on the principal's desk one morning, calmly explaining where and when she'd found it, and gently voicing her concern. The children all like Mr. Cohen very much. I hope nothing bad comes of this. The principal called Emil in for a talk. No one knew what was said, but when Emil walked out of the principal's office, his face was darker, and more flustered, than anyone had ever seen it. He contacted Lena immediately, but his tone was no longer the tender warmth of before. Instead, it was tense with suppressed annoyance and anxiety. We should stop meeting for a while. There's some trouble at school. Just silly rumors, but I need to lay low. Lena's heart sank. She tried to ask more, but only got a perfunctory brush off. It's for our own good. We'll talk when things calm down. Lay low, rumors, these cold words were like needles, popping the colorful bubble of true love she'd blown with her fantasies. For the first time, she clearly saw that their relationship was something to be hidden, something to lay low for, something that could bring trouble. She locked herself at home, clutching her phone, distracted and restless. Every notification made her jump, but none were from him. Every second of waiting felt like struggling in cold, sticky honey, endless, suffocating. Matteo noticed her odd behavior, but he assumed she was still angry about the birthday party, or had sunk into one of those mood slumps he could never understand. He tried to smooth things over by suggesting a trip to a suburban ski resort with her and Luca one weekend. Lena was distracted the whole drive. Matteo tried to make small talk, but got no response. Luca, though, was excited, chattering away in the backseat. They stopped at a red light, and Matteo picked up his phone to check his credit card bill. He made a habit of reviewing his company's project expenses regularly. Suddenly, his brows furrowed, his finger pausing on the screen. Lena, his voice held a hint of confusion. Morning mist in. What were you doing there recently? Multiple times. Lena's blood turned to ice in an instant. She spun around, her face as white as a sheet. Matteo looked at her sudden paleness, the confusion in his eyes quickly turning to shock, then to a dark, stormy livid. He was no longer the husband who ignored her, he was a man whose anger had been ignited in an instant. Lena Valentino! He practically roared, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. The car horn blared piercingly loud, making Luca in the backseat jump. Tell me. What the hell were you doing at a place like that? With who? The car became a closed, explosive prison. Lena's lips trembled, unable to say a word. Tears gushed out, not from grievance, but from the fear and shame of having her pretense torn away, bare and raw. Speak. Matteo's eyes were red, as if he might burst into flames. I. Lena broke down. The loneliness, grievance, and pain of being unrecognized that had built up for so long found a twisted outlet in this moment. It's all your fault. You only care about work. Only about your damn sketches. When have you ever even looked at me? Do you have any idea how miserable I am every day? I'm invisible. Emil, at least he listens to me. At least he sees me. She rambled, sobbing hoarsely, spilling everything. The anger on Mateo's face froze as her accusations poured out, then shattered, revealing a look of almost dazed disbelief. It was as if he was seeing the woman he'd lived with for years for the first time, seeing the bottomless pain and despair in her eyes. A deadly silence fell over the car. Only Lena's choked sobs, and the faint, frightened whimpers of Luker in the backseat, could be he.